And I know how much effort has gone into boiling this down in a way that can really help you to focus on the highlights of what this longer commentary and translation offers. And I have really enjoyed reading and rereading the book of First Enoch, also with Second Enoch. These are fabulous texts, and I hope that as Professor Nickelsburg was talking, you could just begin linking your thoughts with many of the things here that are strangely familiar, but also quite oddly unusual to us. But that's only more provocative to stimulate our thought and try to understand more things that haven't been perfectly obvious to us before. I also would like you to think about why early Christians would have been so smitten by this book. There is in the book of Jude in the New Testament a quote from First Enoch. And so we know that early Christians saw many points in common with this, including Jesus' critique of the making of the temple of Herod into a den of thieves, question of the pollution of that temple. Obviously, there would be authority for that position here in First Enoch. And lots of other points that are just really interesting, not just historically, scripturally, but also in terms of temple themes, dozens of which populate this text and bear wonderful fruit as we look into them. So let me first invite Lauri to come up, and we've asked the panelists to come speak here from the microphone. So come on up, and they will first be responding in this part of the panel discussion to points that George has raised. And then we'll, after the three of them have commented, we'll let Professor Nickelsburg respond to the three of them.
Thank you. I will pause and collect my thoughts. I think that the Book of Enoch is one of the more important books that many of us have never heard of, or at least not until recently. And so the first point that I want to make is just to reiterate maybe a couple of reasons why that book is important to us. The Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew source of the Old Testament, briefly mentions Enoch. And the temple that it describes in terms of beliefs and practice is the second temple, which is the temple is the temple that was built when the Jews returned from Babylon. The Masoretic text gives the impression that everyone was unified in support of the second temple. And it was not until the Book of Enoch was studied, and it wasn't really studied until the 20th century, that we learned that some, if not many people, were critical of the second temple, as Dr. Nickelsburg has showed us today. And many of you were here in October when Margaret Barker was here. And she taught us then that great pains were taken to suppress First Temple beliefs, covenants, and rituals from that Masoretic text. And she told us then that her life's work has been to reconstruct the First Temple, and her first tool that she used was the first Book of Enoch. So with her work, then the discipline of temple studies was born. So I think that's another reason why the Book of Enoch is important for those people that are here today. As we've learned just a little bit, but I guess I will emphasize this again, for early Christians, the Book of Enoch was very important and was considered scripture. And it is not only quoted in the New Testament, but it's referenced often. The worldview of the Book of Enoch was the worldview of those early Christians. And as you read the Book of Enoch, you will read about thrones and angels and judgments. And then when you reread the New Testament, you will read about thrones and angels and judgments, and then you know where they come from. Just as an example of that, I want to read you a very well-known few verses from the book of Matthew. And as you hear these again, perhaps you'll know where some of these ideas come from. This is Matthew 25, verses 31 through 40. When the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then he shall sit on his throne of glory. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate them one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats, and he will place the sheep at his right hand, but the goats at the left. Then the king shall say to those at his right hand, Come, O blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? And the king will answer them, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me. So I just wanted to bring it to your attention again, why we should appreciate the Book of Enoch, and in particularly why we should appreciate the work that Dr. Nickelsburg has done to translate this book and give us these great commentaries for the book of 1st Enoch. I find it very interesting as I listen to Dr. Nickelsburg's paper today, how much the writer or the writers of this were not thrilled at all with the Jerusalem temple. And in the Book of Watchers, we read that Enoch the prophet speaks out against the priests of the heavenly temple, and Dr. Nickelsburg concludes that this is really a critique of the Jerusalem temple. And the critique here is that the priests are having forbidden contact with earthly women. And they have violated the purity law, which is that they have come into contact with blood. Now, there's an old saying that the past is a foreign country and they do things differently there. And from our viewpoint, to be defiled by coming into contact with human blood seems like a particularly strange thing. But really, that's not a bad way to go in terms of a purity law. And I just want to take a minute and explain to you why I think that that's not a bad law. And that is because everybody has a body. And so this law can apply to everybody quite equally. It can apply to a rich man or a rich woman pretty well equally, right? Because everybody can come into contact with blood equally. It can apply to foreigners. It can apply to the richest man in the kingdom or the poorest person. So a law of defilement that has to do with something that comes from the body is not a bad way to have a purity law. So even though it seems very strange to us, a purity law based on something that comes from the body doesn't really exclude everyone. And you can choose whether you're going to follow that purity law or not. And there are also things that you can do to become clean again if you violate that law. So, at least according to the law as it's written in Leviticus or Numbers or some of the other writings that we have. Now, while the exiles were returning and restoring the temple, which is the beginning of the Second Temple period, we see at that time that the purity laws were shifting, and the way that you're expressing the purity laws is perhaps shifting to exclusion. So non-Jews are being excluded from covenants and temple worship. Mixed blood Jews are being excluded. And also the people of the land, the Am Haaretz, are also being excluded. Okay, these are people that are Jews, but they were not people that went away in the exile. Okay, so they're being excluded for not being pure enough, even though they are Jews. So the purity laws are changing at that time. And I submit that perhaps this is the reason that the writers of the Book of Enoch are upset with the priests in Jerusalem. Maybe the reason that they don't like the priests or that the purity laws have changed. And the purity laws have changed from being based on the defilement from the body to being based on defilement by exclusion. Just an idea. Thank you for coming. We've enjoyed having you here today, and I've probably taken more than enough time, and I'll turn it over to my learned colleagues now. Thank you.
I'm going to have to stand on tiptoes here. Professor Nickelsburg, may I express my appreciation for your willingness to travel here and make this presentation today, as well as for your masterful work on First Enoch, both your translation and your very useful 2-volume commentary, which I've had a fair amount of occasion lately to make use of as I've been doing a little work on Enoch as he pertains to early Christianity and to ancient Egyptian religion as well. And I might also add, it's been a real pleasure to make your acquaintance on this trip. My comments, and ultimately my question for you, pertain less to the text of First Enoch than to what may perhaps be termed the ancient tradition of Enoch. And by ancient tradition, I mean not just the use of Enoch and Enoch texts in the post-Second Temple period in the Hellenistic era or the early Christian era, but also the tradition of Enoch that may have preceded the Second Temple period, both in Hebrew tradition and also in other ancient traditions as well. So the ancient tradition of Enoch and also its connection to the theology of the heavenly temple in particular, which you've mentioned and discussed in your presentation today, and similarly its connection to the theology of the ascent to the throne of God, that you have also noted as an important component in the First Enoch text. Ascent theology and ascent ritual have been suggested to have comprised an important component in the temple traditions of other peoples, particularly those of the ancient Egyptians, whose ceremonial, I have argued, influenced the ritual of Hebrew temples in the era of the First Temple. In today's presentation, you associate First Enoch with the Second Temple and date to that Second Temple period the composition of First Enoch between the 4th century BCE and the turn of the era. You also mentioned that the 5 tractates were composed in the Aramaic language common in the Second Temple period. At the beginning of the first volume of your Enoch commentary, you present the same view in a bit more detailed fashion, writing, quote, "The discovery of the Qumran Aramaic manuscripts makes it virtually certain that Aramaic was the language in which chapters 1 through 36 and chapters 72 through 107 were composed, although the authors may have drawn on some Hebrew sources. Whether chapters 30, and you point this out in your papers as well today, whether chapters 37 to 71 and 108 were composed in Hebrew or Aramaic is less certain, since no Aramaic fragments of either section were found at Qumran. You also cite as evidence for this conclusion Millich's 1976 publication of the Aramaic fragments of 1st Enoch. Dr. Margaret Barker, whose work has been instrumental in founding temple studies in Britain and here in the United States, particularly in this area, and who delivered the keynote address at the day-long Temple Studies Conference held on this campus at the end of October, was equally versed in Millich's work, but reached an alternative conclusion that while a language of the text was certainly Aramaic, from which indeed the Greek translations and later the Ethiopic translation may have derived, nevertheless what she construes to have been the important connection of the Enoch tradition to the ritual of the first temple rather than the second, at least to her, suggested earlier Enoch texts composed in Hebrew. My own teacher, Professor Hugh Nibley, whose work on Enoch and the Enoch tradition in the early to mid-1970s is familiar to many here, occurred, of course, before the final collocation and dissemination of the Aramaic Enoch fragments, though Nibley's monograph collecting and expanding that earlier work was published afterward. That's his book that many of you know as Enoch the Prophet. Despite the discovery of the Aramaic fragments, Professor Nibley also posited earlier Hebrew texts based on the presence of an Enoch tradition in First Temple Judaism, as well as in a variety of temple cultures. We are all aware that in contemporary academia, universities are organized into departments, and departmental boundaries tend to encourage the compartmentalization of knowledge. Nibley's great strong point was that, by contrast, his scholarship was not compartmentalized, but ranged over millennia and throughout a variety of Near Eastern and Mediterranean cultures. His work on the Egyptian temple ritual is comprehensive, with special emphasis on the ascent theology of the ancient Egyptians. And to those ascent rituals, he connects directly Enoch and the Enoch tradition through the comparative figure of the Egyptian Thoth. I'm not sure whether you may have been introduced to any of this by Professor Welch before, but that's his thesis, that the Egyptian temple stood as an intermediary between the Enochian temple, which he considered Enoch to be an actual historical figure in time, and that it stood as an intermediary between those earlier temple traditions of the patriarchs and the later Hebrew temple traditions. But he connects Enoch to Thoth, who he identifies as virtually identical in role, function, experience, and teaching to the figure of Enoch, at least as depicted in the texts of 1st Enoch and 2nd Enoch. Moreover, he links to this ascent theology even in ancient Egypt, the chosen one that you talked about today, and referred to, of course, in the text of 1st Enoch, associating him not only with Yahweh and Yahweh's earthly incarnation as Christ, but also with the Egyptian Horus and his earthly incarnation as Osiris. Well, given that, my question then to you, takes a long time to get to the question, doesn't it? My question then to you is, do you think that the Enoch tradition, that at least a minority of scholars have argued to have been present at least as early as eras of Judaism before that of the Second Temple, as well as present in other religious traditions, constitutes any reason at all to consider a more open interpretation that would allow for earlier composition of 1st Enoch than the Second Temple period, and for topical or thematic association with not only the Second Temple, but also the First Temple. And lastly, for translation into Aramaic rather than composition in Aramaic.
My current passion is the Gospel of Luke. So, as I've heard Professor Nickelsburg talk, I've been sifting this sort of thing through my head with a different set of antennas. I'll pick up my antenna. Well, let me just offer a couple of observations about Luke's Gospel and the temple. Not least among Luke's interests is the temple in Jerusalem. The Gospel's interest, of course, is framed very differently from how it appears in 1st Enoch. In fact, the temple steps into our sight almost as soon as we begin to read Luke's account. For his very first report has to do with Zacharias the priest and his ministration in the temple's sanctuary at the altar of incense just outside the curtain that hides the Holy of Holies. By noting this sacred place and one of the activities that occurs therein, Luke confers a sense of the sacred onto the whole of his long narrative, a narrative that includes his gospel and the book of Acts. And this sense of holiness never evaporates from his two accounts. Instead, it perfumes everything that he writes. Let's skip some of this. In Luke's report, the temple is a place of sacred instruction, as illustrated by both a story of the youthful Jesus among Jewish savants and his teaching in the temple during the last week of his life. The temple is the location of sacred acts, as Mary's offering for her ritual cleansing after giving birth demonstrates. Luke features other sacred occasions at the temple that include Simeon and Anna finding the Christ child, the publican's prayer, God be merciful to me a sinner, and the poor widow's offering of the 2 mites or leptos coins. This brief review leads us into every courtyard in the temple and shows them all to be sacred. For we traverse from the huge court of Gentiles, where Simeon and Anna find Jesus' parents, to the court of women, where the poor widow comes to place her offering and Jesus teaches, to the inner courtyard, where Mary's offering of the 2 birds occurs on the great altar of sacrifice, to the sanctuary where Zacharias approaches the altar of incense that stands before the veil of the temple. Hence, as Luke unfolds his narrative, sacred acts occur everywhere within the temple grounds. One of the issues that Professor Nickelsburg raises is that of ceremony and liturgy, particularly as it's sung. In Luke, we hear nothing sung except in quotations from Psalms. But it seems to me that we may get into the world of liturgy in the Messianic banquet that Jesus promises to his faithful followers at the end time. They will, quote, eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, close quote. Although he speaks these words at the Last Supper in a private setting, that is in somebody else's home, or the upper story of the home, embedded in them is the promise of sharing Jesus' table in a formal, sacred place. One important hint arises in a story that Jesus associates with striving, quote, to enter in at the strait gate, close quote, in chapter 13. In that account appears the master of the house, an English expression that grows out of a single Greek noun, oikodespotes. In this passage, the master of the house represents more than just a homeowner. How so? Because among other guests, this person will host Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all the prophets in his house, a place that Jesus calls the kingdom of God. The notion of a house owned by God, of course, calls up the temple, which by itself is often called the house of God, or simply the house in Hebrew. Hence, it is not far-fetched to think of the Messianic banquet as a formal liturgical act taking place within God's house at the end time. So, there may be some flavor of liturgy or ceremony into that in Jesus' interest in the Messianic banquet at the end time. I'm interested that it's been decades since I read through First Enoch. So I was interested in rereading passages that Professor Nickelsburg has drawn to our attention, where Enoch effectively becomes the Son of Man, whose mantle is righteousness. I immediately thought of a passage in the so-called Melchizedek Midrash of the Dead Sea Scrolls, in which Melchizedek is seen also as an exemplar of righteousness, almost as a messianic figure in that sense. I'm also interested in Enoch as the chosen one. So too Jesus is the chosen one. There are two passages that leap to mind. I just thought of these sitting over there. One, of course, is the scene on the Mount of Transfiguration. In the King James text, the words of the Father are quoted as "my beloved Son," but the better reading is "my chosen Son." Then, as Jesus hangs on the cross, those who stand nearby sort of blabbering on, if he were the chosen one, he would come down. So there's this sense of Jesus who comes as the chosen one, much as Enoch is nominated as the chosen one in First Enoch. I puzzled about these attacks on the priesthood. Professor Nickelsburg has suggested that these attacks really are aimed at current officials at the temple, priests, Levites, perhaps, and others. I've wondered if this is a stereotypical attack. That is, that there is the sense that those guys up there at the temple are corrupt, and it must include, besides offering blemished lambs, it must include their personal lives as well. Maybe it isn't that way. But sort of the last point, I'm interested that the Enoch literature didn't gain more traction. It certainly does for a while among Christians, and obviously among certain Jewish groups. Then it seems to lose its appeal, except among Abyssinian Christians in Ethiopia. Those people have accepted the book of First Enoch as scriptural or canonical, and of course, as Professor Nickelsburg has mentioned, that's where we see almost all the copies. There are bundles of copies. These guys who worked on the NEH, there was a team from a college in Minnesota that worked at microfilming manuscripts in Ethiopia. And they found themselves microfilming manuscript after manuscript of the Book of Enoch. Well, That's not the only thing there, but there were so many there that they had to ask for clarification from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which sponsored them. Do you want us to keep copying this stuff? So it's the Abyssinian Christians who have preserved this for us in the main. Well, I've enjoyed Dr. Nickelsburg's presentation. I don't know that I really presented any questions for him, just some observations. Thanks.
Well, last shall be first. Actually, they are now digitizing hundreds of manuscripts. I mean, when I was into this stuff, they were carrying these huge microfilm machines over the mountains, and Ethiopia is full of mountains, believe me. Though I've never been there, I sort of have that sense. And now they're digitizing this stuff by the hundreds, and they'll figure out some way of collating this stuff eventually. Yeah, well, okay. Also, sort of the last shall be first and first shall be last here. The early church, the fathers, I hate using that term, but they were all fathers. The fathers of the early church, most of them, an awful lot of them, thought the Enoch stuff was great. Up until Augustine. Can you all hear me back here? No, okay. Okay, I'll do it this way. Okay. Up until St. Augustine, or actually Jerome, the story, the explanation of the fall was Enoch. It was not Adam. It was the Enochic stuff. And even when Enoch was not being quoted, the fall of the Watchers was being used as an explanation for the bringing of not only violence into the world, but all sorts of magic and things of that sort. So the early church appreciated up until Jerome, who didn't like it because the heretics were using it. I mean, it was criticism by association is what it was. So Jerome didn't like the thing. And then Augustine didn't like it, I think, because it was anthropology. I think he wanted to get Adam in there as the source of all evil because of his understanding of, his anthropology of the flesh and so forth. And then after that, it just kind of fell out in Western Christianity. It was preserved by the Ethiopian church because they didn't have the issues, the heretical issues down there that the Western church was having with Gnosticism and so forth. So it's kind of tricky how these things fall out and how they come back again. Just one other comment about the New Testament and I think the closest parallel to the parables of Enoch is the Book of Revelation, and the closest parallel to the Book of Revelation anywhere is the parables of Enoch, and I just think that's a connection. And if you read R.H. Charles's commentary on Revelation, which is 2 volumes, like all great commentaries are, and his commentary on Revelation, I think, was the last big thing he did, and it was kind of the capstone of the text after text, apocalyptic text that he had been publishing and doing text on and so forth and so on. So I think that if one reads the book of Revelation through the the prism of the parables, one sees lots of interesting sorts of things. Now, what about pre-exilic, pre-Enochic Enochicism? I don't know. I mean, the earliest Enoch texts that we have are the Aramaic texts. Now, there are some characters around who are sort of indicating that there are early Enoch traditions. But the only Enoch tradition that we have of any length, the only texts that we have of any length, are the Aramaic texts. Now, it's a funny sort of thing that you get some bilingualism going on in some parts of Enoch, but we all do this. My daughter lived for a year in Holland and then went to study German. And when she came home studying German, and she starts talking half German, half Dutch, and she's driving her teacher crazy. I mean, the thing is that if you know 2 languages, it's very easy. I mean, Yarad does not work in Aramaic. It says in the days of Yarad, and it's playing on the idea of descending angels descending them. Well, Yarad is a Hebrew root, is not an Aramaic root. And so something's going on there about old traditions. But, I mean, the earliest stuff that we have of the Book of Enoch stuff is the Aramaic text of Enoch. Now, I just don't see an awful lot of Enoch in the Hebrew Bible. And Margaret Barker and I sort of disagree on this, although it's been 20 years since I've read her book, and I don't want to say any more about that because I really don't know. But I just don't see it now. And one always has to ask the question, if you've got biblical stuff here and you got parabiblical stuff here, how does that mix together and what is knowing what? And oral traditions, of course, are always an easy way out, but oral tradition is also the way that it works. So I don't know, and I just don't know the Egyptian stuff. I know a little bit of the Babylonian stuff, which is also very closely connected with Enoch stuff. And if you read the part of the commentary that was written by James Vanderkam, you'll find that he finds an awful lot of the Babylonian stuff in there. So, but I mean, one thing doesn't necessarily exclude another. There's Hellenistic stuff that I always like to tease James Vanderkam about, because he's into the Babylonian stuff. I was doing Greek stuff, and the two don't necessarily exclude one another. Hellenism does not have to be written in Greek, as you know. I just don't know. I stick to the text that we have, which are written in Aramaic. The parables are tricky because we don't have anything else, but I have a fairly long section on there. And my point is it Hebrew? Is it Aramaic? I think it's probably Aramaic, just because all the rest of the Enoch stuff is in Aramaic, and there's nothing. And I sweated through this stuff because you have to retrovert to get at this stuff. You have to retrovert Ethiopic into Greek, and then try to retrovert Greek into, is it Aramaic or is it Hebrew? And you go crazy, and you'll notice in my commentary that I usually give Hebrew and Aramaic roots both, because I don't want someone to say that I'm premising a lot of stuff on Aramaic when it might have been Hebrew. I just don't know, and there are parallels in religious traditions, and the Middle East flowed back and forth like this, and we don't know what was being carried by whom and what kind of religious tradition. So I just don't know. I mean, I see nothing beyond this little thing in Genesis about Enoch. I remember this Lutheran pastor in Boston once said, "How in the world can you write a commentary on 2 verses of Genesis?" Well, I know some commentaries that could. There are some people. There used to be, who was it? Was it Edward Schweitzer? I think it was a German New Testament professor who would lecture on the Gospel of John, and the Word never became incarnate. But I just don't see that. I think you can tell from my commentaries that I think that the Enoch stuff is loaded with material that is paralleled in the Hebrew Bible, and this was the world in which they lived and so forth. And I just never thought about the Egyptian stuff, and one would have to think about what the parallels were, and whether you bring bundles of stuff together or whatever. Tot was the guy who was the scribe, right? Yeah. I haven't looked at Egyptian stuff in a very, very long time. So, yeah. Okay. As to Luke, it's, I find it fascinating about the various loci in the temple. I never really thought of that, although, of course, I noticed that the temple goes from the beginning of Luke way into Acts. Did you ever read Klaus Balzer's article in Harvard Theological Review maybe 40 years ago? It must have been on the temple in Luke. It might be worth looking at. The interesting thing is that, as I wrote an article years ago about how the Epistle of Enoch seems to be presumed in the Gospel of Luke. I still think that's probably the case, and that would be sort of strange if you're coming around with with the temple being upside down in Luke, or right side up in Luke's gospel. And I don't. What did the Jerusalem priests do in their bedrooms? We know what they did in their bedrooms. Who knows what they're doing and when they're doing? This is what you say about your enemies. If you've got an enemy, you say that he's doing things at the wrong time or the right thing, or that's the way you do it. You don't argue issues. You plaster people with nasty words and so forth. So we don't really know. But there seem to be some ritual sorts of things going on in there. So is it so? The chosen one. Yeah, that's my favorite. That's my favorite one about Luke, because I think chosen one is used in the Psalms, maybe in Samuel. I don't know, certainly in the Psalms for the Messiah. I'm pretty sure Psalm 87. I can't remember which Psalm it is. I think it's used in the parables. I didn't really go into this. In the parables, this author brings together traditions that are taken from Daniel 7, that are taken from the Messianic Psalms, Psalm 8. They're all going through my head right now, but there are three or four of the Psalms that are used. Psalm 2. Psalm 2, you are my son, today have I begotten you. From the Psalms, from the Messianic oracles in Isaiah 11, and from there's one of the Messianic texts I can't think of, and from the second Isaiah, the servant of the Lord sort of stuff, and all of these texts are conflated, are brought together in the parables of Enoch, so that the chosen one, which is an important title for the Son of Man, for the servant of the Lord, that the chosen one is also the Son of Man, who is also the Messiah, and who is, Son of Man, Messiah, and chosen one, and who is also the embodiment of heavenly wisdom. On top of that, he's all for this wisdom sort of stuff. But it's all one character, okay? And so I wonder, when I read the Lucan texts where the chosen one is used, I can't remember if it's used in the Transfiguration story, I think too. What's he talking about? And if there is a tradition that all of these figures are in fact one and the same figure, then you can sort of play this language back and forth. The Mark and Passion narrative is a messianic kind of thing, King of Israel, whatever it is. But if in the mind of some author these figures are all the same, then you see you can use different kinds of titles, but we have to be careful about that, because I think chosen one is a Davidic title, right? Correct? Yeah. So, but I've always found it interesting that Luke does use that term chosen one, where you might expect Messiah or King, or I can't remember what the other synoptic terms are. So that's, I told you before, Luke's my favorite guy. It's the only gospel in 31 years of teaching in Iowa that I ever taught a course on. Did a little bit with Luke, never touched Matthew, although I should have, and I never had the nerve to go into John. It's just something I never was willing to tackle. But Luke I like, and I don't understand why people don't like Luke, because it says a lot to the way our world ought to be and isn't today. So yeah, chosen one is, and I've never really run that through my filter, except that when I see that in Luke, I think parables of Enoch. So, I've talked enough.
Thank you.